Do you agree? Camera exposure is the single most factor which affect the quality of your photograph. Hi, I am Afsal Koroth and today I am going to talk about camera exposure. Camera exposure is the amount of light that enters your camera when you take a photograph. It affects the brightness of the photo you have taken. If more light is entering inside your camera, the picture becomes more bright and vice versa. This exposure is decided by three factors, and these three factors are called exposure triangle. These three factors are: one is shutter speed, second is aperture, third is ISO. We will examine one by one. First one is shutter speed. Shutter speed decides the amount of light that enters your camera based on the time duration for which the shutter is open. If the shutter is open for a longer time, more light enters the camera and falls on the sensor and the picture becomes more bright. And if the shutter is open for a fraction of a second, it's very short time, very less amount of light enters the camera. Shutter speed is having two functions. One is, as I explained, that is exposure. Second one is about motion blur. Most of the time you will be taking photographs of moving objects like wild animals or birds or sports photographs where the subject is continuously moving. If the shutter is open for a longer time, that movement is captured in the sensor. That means in the photograph, if you see, you can find the motion. But if the shutter is open for a very short duration, like 1/400th of a second or 1/1000th of a second, it freezes the movement. For example, if you are shooting a waterfall and if you are having very short shutter speed, that means 1/1000th of a second, it freezes the water drops, and in the photograph you will find water drops. But if the shutter speed is maybe 1/10 of a second or 1/30th of a second, you can find the movement of water. You cannot find individual droplets, but it is as a motion you can find this water. So this is one second function of the shutter speed. Shutter speed is expressed as part of the second for which it is open, like 1/10th when the shutter speed is told as 1/10, it means that 1/10th of a second the shutter is open. And most of the cameras offer a maximum shutter speed of 30 seconds. That means shutter is open for 30 seconds. And the other end, it depends on the camera. Some cameras offer 1/10,000th of a second and more depending on the camera. And next one is aperture. Aperture is the amount of light that enters the camera depending on the how much that shutter is open, how width that shutter is open. For example, it is expressed as f-stop. F-stop means it measures the diameter of the opening. For example, f2, if you are telling f2, it is having more opening compared to f11 or f18. f18 is small. It usually goes up to f32. When the aperture is f1.4, it is having very wider opening and more light enters the camera and hit the sensor. That means the picture become more bright when the aperture is low or when the opening is more. It is similar to the pupil in our eyes. When you enter a dark room, you will find that the pupil relaxes. That opening at the center of the eye becomes bigger. So more light enters. And when you enter from a dark room to a bright outside, where it is very bright, the pupil shrinks, it contracts. So the opening in the middle center become very small and less light enters the eye. Similar function is there for aperture in camera. It is having two functions. One, as I explained, it decides the brightness of or the exposure. Second is the depth of field. If the aperture is open for if the aperture is having more opening, that means f maybe 1.4 or 2, it is having less depth of field. For example, if you are photographing a portrait photograph with face, one person's face, if you are photographing, you want to get the focus, you want to focus only on the face, not the background. Background most of the time it is very it's not clear, blurred. So you use a higher opening, that means maybe 1.4 or 1.8 f. But when you are maybe you are photographing outside view, like mountains or something like that, you need to have higher aperture. That means maybe f11 or f18, so that the depth of field is more. Depth of field means it is the distance from the front of the subject to the back of the subject, how much it is focused. If you are having, for example, f18, you focus for a longer distance. For example, mountains. So more things are coming into your photograph. More things are having are under good focus. So these are the two functions of aperture. Third one is ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of the camera sensor towards light. It is not having any relationship with the amount of light entering inside the camera, as we are talking about shutter speed and aperture. ISO affect the sensitivity. That means if for example, if the light is less, the late evening, you can have higher ISO, maybe 1000 ISO, so that the camera sensor is more sensitive for the less light. And in the daylight, you can have maybe 100 ISO 100. Why we are keeping ISO at the minimum? We should always keep ISO at the minimum possible, because when the ISO is more, grains start appearing in the photograph, and the quality of the photograph is affected. So we should keep ISO to the minimum, maybe 100. Most of the cameras offer minimum of 100, or some cameras offer even less than the 100. And depending on the camera, ISO can be very high. Some cameras offering up to 52,000 ISO and all. That depends on the camera. These are the three factors which affect the exposure of the photograph. And you can play with all these three factors to get the desired output. If you want to capture a motion, if you want to freeze the motion, you can have higher shutter speed. That means you can have maybe 1/1000th of a second shutter speed, so that you can capture you can freeze the motion. And depending on the type of picture that you are taking, maybe portrait or landscape or something else, or maybe sports photography, depending on that one, you can change either aperture or shutter speed or ISO. Thank you.